Shalom. Good to see you. Well, actually, it's good to be with you. Today, I want to do the parsha called Toldot. Toldot is the idea of generations, and that's what we're going to talk about. And we start with a very strange definition of generations as we look at this particular portion. Now, last portion, which was Sarah, we found ourselves ending with a discussion of the generations of Ishmael. Today, we're going to start with this understanding of the generations of Isaac. And so for this, I want you to look at chapter 25, verse number 19, which is the beginning of this section. And the very strange way that he starts. He begins by saying these are the offspring of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Now, which is it? Or is there something that's hidden in our story that we don't see quite as easily? And to understand this, we're going to have to understand that there's going to be some hints, that our language that we're going to use or the places that we will go for the information to fill in the blanks comes by way of the Talmud, and comes by way of the Midrash, and comes by way of the Zohar. These are the sources whereby things are explained a little bit more thoroughly. We have the basic information. So let's go back and let's start adding to the story. First off, we have to understand these are the offspring of Isaac, son of Jacob, or son of Abraham. And then it says, Abraham begot Isaac. Well, we're actually looking at two births here. We're looking at what we would call the natural birth. That's where Abraham begot Isaac, which is the second half. But our story really is going to be about the birth of Isaac's conscience. The idea is that Abraham did birth Isaac, but Isaac himself was not active. He had no conscious understanding of what was going on or sense of knowing where to go. Now he's going to be 180 years old when he dies. And what we're talking about here begins in a section after the death of Sarah and after the marriage of Isaac to Rebekah. We understand that at this point in time, he is some 40 years old. But let's look even closer than that. There seems to be a change in our character that begins at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac on the altar, in which our character now becomes more open. Now, in terms of being open, he lives 180 years, but we're only going to spend a few verses talking about him. We spend a great number of verses talking about Abraham, and we spend a lot more verses talking about his son, Jacob. So what we have to look at is how important are the events that are given to us and what can we understand from them? And so we're going to look hopefully into all of this. And I want you to begin to understand that Isaac, unlike his father, is going to be what I would call a hidden tzaddik. He is a righteous man who does not take the stage as his father had. His father was very open. His father was very much a hesed, a loving, kind person who invited everyone into his home. We're not going to see a lot of invitations into Isaac's home. In fact, we're not going to see any. Isaac himself is going to be a far different character. In fact, the only thing that we'll be able to recognize about him is the fact that he was able to make a lot of animals, create or gather a lot of animals to his understanding. But at the same point in time, he will dig wells. That's what appears to be a profession, but that's far from understanding who he was or what's going on. So there's something that's going to be hidden about this character. Very righteous, very ordered, but at the same time, not as naturally open as his father was. In fact, Abraham, remember way back when he didn't have children, said he wouldn't mind if this heritage was passed on through Ishmael, because Ishmael was a very open person. He was very much like, in some sense, very much like the character of Abraham. So there's very different things. Also have to understand when a baby is born, how often do people come over and say, oh, he looks like, or she looks like, and they tell which one of the parents she looks like, or he looks like. But it's not so much what's happening in the early years, but as we watch them grow, that especially a parent can see things in that child that may not be known by the rest of the world, but is known very much by them. There are characteristics, there are things that they do, mannerisms, which follow very much into the family. And so that's going to be part of what's going to happen. So these physical skills and traits are going to be such that we will see the idea of him. In fact, according to the Midrash, Isaac, looked very much like Abraham. Some understand that he looked almost identical, and the reason that he needed to was because most people said that when his wife Rebecca was captured by the Philistines, that the baby was actually Ahimelech's, not Isaac's. And so the child had to have the physical characteristics of their father. And so that's the way we begin our story. Now, the second half of this birth, unlike the first, is going to talk about the constant change, or the consistent change, both emotionally and intellectually, as well as spiritually. It's about the things that we project that we feel do not reflect us. For some, it's the projection of animosity or fear in others. Well, they see themselves as kind and gentle. It'd be like me. When I was a principal, one of the things that obviously happens is that everybody sees you differently than what you want to portray yourself to be. So you have to work hard to show your real self. Now, I did hold that position, but at the same point in time, I didn't want my kids in school to fear me. So I had to work hard at making it so that they could relate to me and yet at the same time respect me. So many different things happened during the course of the years. One of the things that I adopted that became very successful for me, in fact, parents even continued to do it long after I had their children, and that was the high five. The high five was a matter of touch. In other words, there was this feeling, this physical sense of it's okay that was related to it. Some kids went beyond the touch, they went and hugged me. But the concept is the fact that I was relatable. And that's what we have to understand in Isaac and what's going on in his life. So we see ourselves differently than the world sees us, and we try to marry those two into one thing. There are times people should feel threatened by me or by you, but how does one express that whole idea of feeling in a positive way? No surprises, no embarrassments. This is called developing the mature mind, as the Jews would call it. That is what Abraham gave birth to Isaac when he finally developed what we would call that pure mind, or the mature mind. Now, Isaac being a hidden tzaddik, there are several hints that may help us to understand who he was. Now, I told you he's going to live to be 180 years old. Isaac's gematria, in other words, the value of the letters of his name, are 182, which doesn't mean anything except that the word for offspring is tzetze. Tzetze means to go out. In other words, when one is birthed, one goes out from inside the mother's womb. Tzetze has a value of 91. So the understanding is that it hints at the fact that Jacob was born to Isaac when he was 91 years old. That's when the first child came. Now, Jacob, on the other hand, will also give birth at the age of 91 to Joseph. Now, Joseph is the character that we find in his lineage, or in his generation. He will be that one that is the hidden one. He is the sod, he is the secret. He's the foundation of all of this. And so as we go through this, then we have to understand there are plateaus and understandings and changes that are going to happen. We also have to understand in the terms of the Sephrot, the right side is called Hesed. Now, the right side is also the masculine side. It's, again, Abraham was very open. He was very much to show. On the other side was Isaac. Isaac was Gevarah. He had strength, but it was more reserved. He was also very more feminine, because the left side speaks of the femininity and the right side speaks of masculinity, and the center speaks of the balance of the two. And so as we begin to look at this, Abraham is Hesed, Isaac is Gevarah, Tefret, which is the center line, the heart of this whole thing, is Jacob, who will be the main focus of what's going to happen as we go through this whole story. Now, to this point, I want to explain why there were two expressions for Isaac, the natural birth and then the second birth. Remember, Isaac represents might, which is feminine. So when he did his second birth again, he actually went through in Genesis 22, went through the actual process of being Akedah, the sacrifice. It was at that point in time that his feminine side was replaced by a masculine. And it's only after that that he's ever going to be, well, he's going to marry at the age of 40. And he's also going to have at that particular point in time, a whole new understanding and a whole new being within him. And the old is going to simply step aside. You know, there's the three characters that we talk about as the patriarchs. There's Abraham, there's Isaac, and then there's Jacob. You realize that Abraham began his life as Avram. Jacob began his life as Jacob, but he'll end his life as Israel. Isaac, the mainstay, never changes his name. He constantly remains Isaac. That's what he is. Yitzhak, he's a laughter. In other words, there is some humor in it, but it's not something that happened to him. It was his mother who laughed and created that whole incident. Now, remember that Isaac, in order to arrive at Mount Sinai or Mount Moriah, went through a 3-day journey. Isaac's not a child when he goes through that journey. He's going to experience many experiences. In fact, his father is going to have him carrying the bundle of wood up the hill. Even before that, there's going to be times when Hasatan attempts to divert he and his father away from the journey. In fact, there's one place where Satan will actually create an imaginary river that is flowing so hard that they would have never crossed through it, but yet at the same time, they walk through it. So we also have to add to that, the day that Isaac is offered is the same day that his mother dies. In other words, the feminine side leaves him, his mother. Remember, his life was built around his mother. And at that particular point in time, she is taken away from him. And in her place comes the masculine side that's going to take over. So only after that did Abraham begin to look for Isaac's soulmate. We saw the events of Eliezer seeking out Isaac's wife, and he'll be married at 40. But again, look back at chapter 24, and I want you to look at that first verse for a second and notice. Now, Abraham was old, well on in years, and Hashem blessed him, Abraham, with everything. Now, the word for everything is the word bakal. Bakal. Bakal means everything. Rashi would note that it has the same value. The word bakal has the same value as ben, or son. We are being introduced to the fact that he has a son, and the son is going to need a soulmate. But we begin with bakal. Now, some people will also know that the word bakal is also the name of a girl. So some believe that this idea of having everything was having a girl, Isaac, the feminine side. Now, add to Isaac, the value of his name is 208. Now, if you take that and you divide it by 4, you reach the value of 52. Well, 52 happens to be the value of son. Wait, 4 divided into 208 is 4 times 52. Isaac is alluded to in the Pesach, in the Passover, when he deals with the case of the 4 sons. In other words, you look at the characters that are there and how they understand or interpret. Now, like everyone else, I also feel regret over some of my past actions. I'm sure you don't, but I do. I realize I missed some opportunities along the way. In fact, sometimes those opportunities come back to me in my dreams. I focus on them. But I have to remember, I have to believe that God allows me to experience things, and everything is in a divine providence. In other words, there's actions where God has brought things into my path. It is God's providence that prevented me from utilizing or taking advantage of all the opportunities that I've been given. As I shared at the beginning, I want to share Isaac's story minus his earlier events with Jacob and Esau. I want you to go to Genesis, or go to 26, chapter 26, and I want you to look at just a few verses, because this is basically the crux of Isaac and what Isaac was. And for this, I want you to go to the chapter 26, and I want you to go to verse 15. And I want to read a few verses to you. It begins by saying, all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father, the Philistines, stopped up. They filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you have become much mightier than we. So Isaac departed from there, and he encamped in the valley of Gerar and dwelled there. And Isaac dug anew the wells of water, which they had dug in the days of Abraham. His father and the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham's death, and he called them by the same names that his father had called them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of fresh water. And the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So he called the name of that well Essec. And then, because they involved themselves with him, then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. And so he called it Sitnah. And he relocated from there, and he dug again. Now, he dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So it is called by the name Rahabot, and said, for now Hashem has granted us ample space, and we can be fruitful in the land. Okay. Here's the story of Isaac. In his age, the Philistines, where he was now living, because he moved there during the days of a famine, had now asked him to leave because he had become stronger or more wealthy, actually, than they were. His wealth continued to double. In fact, where he was, the people in the villages around him, they also grew in wealth. So the community was blessed by him being there. But at the same time, his presence also was a threat. So he moved further to the east, to Gerar. And now here in the east, where he's now dwelling, he begins to uncover the wells that were there in order to take care of his animals. And so the first well that he drills happens to be the well that you and I would call the well of Essec, which happens to mean animosity or slander in essence. So there was animosity between he and the Philistines, or he and the shepherds that lived in that particular area. And so part of that animosity turned out to be slander, things that began to change simply because of the fact that he was there and that he had a well. Now, in this well that he had dug, he calls it by the same name. So this well had already been a point of contention. But again, it was filled up in the beginning right after the death of Abraham. Nobody could challenge Abraham, who was a Philistine, because they understood Abraham held the magic over them. And so here in this verse, then, there is not a righteous man who does not have a detractor, is basically what we're saying. All of us have it at one point or another. But he prospers there, Abraham does, and now Isaac is prospering. And in doing so, we create enemies, or people begin to become jealous of something that we have or don't have, but they seemingly think we do. And so there was these detractors. And so as he begins to go through this, actually it's contention. I'm ahead of myself. Essec is about contention. So as long as Abraham was alive, everything was fine. But now that he's dead, the wells are filled in. And the reason that the wells were filled in is because the Philistines did not want to give water to their enemies when they came to attack. So they simply allowed the wells to be filled up. Not that they couldn't use the water. The concept was it was the other side, the enemies could not use it. And so they dug the first well. Now this time, Isaac uncovers the well. And the thing that we need to notice is the fact that the well is never recovered. In other words, once it's been opened the second time, it remains open. And so the first well appears. They quarrel over it. And even with that first well being there, they move. And in the direction that they move, they uncover the second well, called Sitna, or the well of animosity, or the well of slander. Again, there is not a righteous man who does not have a detractor. So the concept is that they're at this particular point in time, they find themselves again facing contention, facing strife, facing those things. And again, Isaac opens the well. The well does not get closed up, but Isaac continues to move on. Now, before we go to the third well, I want to go back to a second and understand Abraham was outgoing. Abraham was about sharing God with whomever passed by. But at the same point in time, he also looked for opportunities for water to flow, for kindness to go on, for something to move. In other words, as Hesed is about water, water is the source of life. And so Abraham constantly gave forth the source of life. Now, after he left, his detractors didn't want that source of life. They didn't want people to know about their God, Abraham's God. And so they simply covered it up. But again, Isaac came through. And this time, Isaac opens the wells and the wells continue to remain. And so that is the important understanding. We also have to understand that the water in the well also represents the temple. You see, because the water flows from the temple also. And so the first temple that was up became a point of contention or strife. And remember, Solomon built the temple, but by the second king, Rehoboam, there was a separation, a strife that was created, dissension happened. And so the temple itself became less certain, more controversial, if you will, until finally it was destroyed. Then we go to the well called Sitna, animosity. Again, Israel has been in captivity. They now come back from captivity, or some of them do. And in the process of coming back, they again find themselves in the building of the temple. They find themselves in a situation where the neighbors don't like it. We know that they slander Ezra and Nehemiah as they try to build it. They try to use every strategy possible in order to keep it from happening. But in the course of time, the second temple is up and it is functioning. Now, the first temple functions about 425 years and the second temple functions about 410 years. But in both cases, the temples are destroyed. Now, there's a third temple, or a third well that's been dug. This is the well that we call Rahabot. Now, the idea of Rahabot is the fact that Rahabot speaks of something of a broad path. And so the enlarging of this path. If we look at Ezekiel in chapters 40 to 48, we find out that there will be a third temple that will be built on the land. And that third temple will be large or enlarged. It will cover a great deal of land. In fact, the land will actually change because of the fact of how the nations will be laid out around it. But understand that Isaac puts together this third well. Again, Isaac doesn't flaunt it. He's very humble about everything. The first two wells, he names the same as what his father named them. He doesn't take credit for anything that isn't his. He is self-disciplined. He's self-sacrificed. He has this great strength to work at sustaining another person's ideas. You know, when we share the word of God, when we share Torah, it's important that we share the ideas of others and give them credit for what they've done, because this is what's understood. Now, the world always focuses on the ideal, the extrovert. Example, Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the greatest example right now, because everybody looks up to him for the Tesla, for the rockets, and all the things that he's doing. They listen to every word he says. But, you know, Elon Musk doesn't build rockets by himself, and he doesn't make Teslas by himself. He actually has corps of engineers, people working like an Isaac behind the scenes, doing the part, not taking the credit. The credit goes to the builder, in this case, Musk. And we would do well to understand what's going on and how he does that. And so as we're looking at this process, then we have to understand that Abraham spread light, but in his absence, darkness filtered in. Isaac then took that darkness away by uncovering the wells that were buried in the earth, just as the people became buried back into the society of the godless. He dug away the darkness and he found the sparks. Now, a well is a channel by which a life force comes into this world. By that, I mean, it's always been here, but it's been hidden, buried. Now, it is this channel that opens up, that allows the righteous then to connect with our world, this world that we're in. We, as believers, need to allow the light to flow from us and to channel it, just as these wells did, and allows this world, because this world is really based on where we're at. The other worlds support this world. Their function is to make this world livable. Now, by livable, we mean to have more than just simply the fact of man walking upon the earth, but to make it righteous. And that's where we're going to at this point in time. So Abraham started the process. Isaac will refocus the project. He will reopen that which Abraham had left. Jacob will come next, and Jacob will be the heart of this. He will bring the emotion to this process. He will begin to grow the program. Isaac grew the program, 2 sons. One son which was dedicated to beyond belief to the one God. The other son, who was also brilliant in his own way, but chose the easy way and not the way of God. And so we begin to look at these 2 characters. So when we stop to think about what's going on, my hope is that you and I both come to realize that our job is the job of a hidden tzaddik. We're about the process of uncovering wells. And in a process of uncovering wells is more than enough of a mission for us. We don't have to take any more on than that. So with that, I hope you learned something. Shalom.